Hi, my name's Alex Dolphin and welcome back to another episode of Ex Ante. Today we're going to discuss the case Department of Transportation versus Association of American Railroads. This case was heard in the Supreme Court of the United States in the year 2015. Let's go ahead and jump into the facts of the case. So first, to understand this case, we need to know what Amtrak is. It's the heart of this dispute. Amtrak is a public-private corporation established by the U.S. Congress, and its goal was to improve and operate passenger railways in our country. That's Amtrak. You also need to know what the FRA is, the Federal Railroad Administration. It is an agency tasked with overseeing the railroads in our country. Well, Congress noticed that there were issues with our passenger railways. Trains weren't running on time, they were delayed, oftentimes not showing up. And so what Congress wanted to do was improve this. And so they passed a bill where they told Amtrak and the FRA to establish some performance standards. Now these performance standards would govern the industry as a whole, passenger railway as a whole. And so Amtrak and the FRA were working together to evaluate and eventually set performance standards for the passenger railways in our country. Well, the Association of American Railroads, you can imagine, other railroad operators and passenger railway operators in our country weren't too happy with the idea of Amtrak, a corporation, be it public-private, but a corporation, dictating the performance standards for the whole industry. And that's a problem. That's a problem, one, because it's going to violate due process. This is their argument. Violates due process. The hallmark characteristic feature of due process is a neutral arbiter. Well, Amtrak's not a neutral arbiter. They're not neutral. They have skin in this game. They operate passenger railways in our country. It's not fair for them to be dictating the standards to us. Their other argument is this violates separation of powers. The Constitution very clearly sets out, the accountability, who gets the power, and how those power holders are accountable. Well, Amtrak's not in the Constitution. Public-private corporations aren't in the Constitution. They have no political accountability. This violates the separation of powers. That's their argument. Now, the district court for the District of Columbia did not find that argument persuasive. But on appeal, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals did find the Association of American Railroads argument persuasive and said, this violates the Nondelegation Doctrine. Congress can't do this. They can't give the legislative power to a public-private corporation like Amtrak. Now, this gets appealed to the United States Supreme Court, and that's the opinion that we're discussing here. Now, Justice Kennedy delivers a unanimous ruling in favor of the Department of Transportation, saying that Amtrak can be a part of these standards in the sense that Amtrak is a governmental entity. And it's very important to know that this ruling is very narrow. There were not all of the issues briefed before the court. Not everything was granted cert on. What the court did grant cert on was the question of, is Amtrak a governmental entity? And the court says unanimously, yes, Amtrak is a governmental entity. Well, you might scratch your head a little bit here because Amtrak's a public-private corporation, and the statute, and this is also what the association based its argument on. The statute says that Amtrak is a corporation. It's a private entity. It's not governmental. The statute says that very clearly. So how is the court going to tell us with a straight face that this is a governmental entity? Amtrak is a corporation, has a board of directors, has a president, employees. It's functioning like a corporation, not like an agency or an administration, or not like an administrative agency. But the court says it doesn't really matter so much what Congress said in the statute. What matters more is how this actually is functioning. If we take a look at how Amtrak is functioning, and they say Amtrak is functioning like a governmental entity. First, the Department of Transportation owns all the stock in Amtrak. There's no private ownership of the stock. It's all owned by the U.S. government. Second, the President of the United States appoints board members to the board of Amtrak. They're appointed by the President, like other officers might be. Third, they're subject to substantial congressional oversight. They have to report to Congress multiple times a year. They're subject to that oversight. and they're dependent on the federal government for their funding. They cannot function without funding from the federal government. So when we actually look at Amtrak and what it is and what it does, it is a governmental entity. It might look like a corporation, but for all intent and purposes, it is a governmental entity. And that's the court's argument. It's unanimous, and that's their holding. It is narrow. This is a very narrow ruling. The court doesn't say, well, Amtrak is a governmental entity, and it can definitely be a part of these joint venture regulations and the performance standards. It says, that's going to be for the D.C. Circuit on remand. We only granted cert on a very narrow question, and we're going to answer that question very simply. We've held that Amtrak is a governmental entity in the past, in the case LeBron, where the court said that the First Amendment applied to Amtrak because it was a governmental entity. So there's also stare decisis concerns here. That was simply what we did. And so they say, whether the structure of Amtrak violates the Constitution, well, that's going to be a question for the D.C. Circuit on remand. And it notes that there's a fairly decent argument here because the board is appointed by the President of the United States, but the board in turn appoints the President of Amtrak. So what is the President of Amtrak? That's the question that the D.C. Circuit needs to answer. And if they were to do that, that might find that there is a violation of the Constitution and Amtrak's structure. And that's what the court's saying. Hey, D.C. Circuit, take another look at it. But you can't deny that Amtrak is a governmental entity. Justices Alito and Thomas both write concurrences, and it's very clear that they don't like Amtrak. They don't like the structure of Amtrak. They don't like the idea of Amtrak setting any performance standards for the industry. They're just not big fans there, and they do make that very clear. Justice Alito has a line that's quite memorable. He says, "Liberty requires accountability." I think that's powerful in this sense. There's not as much accountability for Amtrak as there is for Congress. Amtrak is quite isolated from the political process. And so for them to be setting these performance standards, it's really hard to get these people out through the ballot box. And practically, people like you and I that go to the ballot and vote on election day, we don't really think about getting those people out. We don't elect someone thinking like, well, maybe this person can, recommend someone to the president, and then we'll get new board members on Amtrak. These people are quite isolated from the political process, and there's not much accountability on them, and that's Justice Alito's large concern. So it's a very interesting case. It shows that there is a live debate between the functionalists and the formalists and regarding the non-delegation doctrine and separation of powers in administrative law. Thanks for watching this video. If you'd like to see more, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And I hope you have a nice rest of your day. Bye-bye.